Hello and welcome. People Going Places is the second episode of a series called Slices of Life, which aims to capture moments and places. You can watch this episode here on YouTube. I've already released a longer video about the making of the first episode of this series, which is called Flora, which goes into detail about my influences, approach, equipment, post-production, and a lot of other topics. In this video, I'd like to focus on specific aspects of the second episode, People Going Places, particularly the sound design and the Foley, which we'll come to later. Here's an overview of the chapters, which will also be available in the description below so that you can find the topics that are relevant for you. I look at this footage and I see a reluctance and an apprehension of recording people. I'm very interested in people and they're often the subject I want to capture, but I've always had difficulty shooting people in a documentary or street style. The intention of this series was to capture people in candid moments and hence be unnoticed, but even still, you can see my discomfort with filming people directly without their consent. I noticed it does kind of create a nice consistency, as if intentional, and I'm glad it disguises the identities of some people who didn't consent to being recorded, but you can still feel a shyness in the composition and framing, and I'm not sure where my stance is on this. I mean, whether this is something I need to overcome or something that's part of my work in this format, since it obviously isn't an issue on fictional or staged projects. It stems from a fundamental belief that people shouldn't be recorded without their consent. And yet some really important and amazing work has come from exactly that. I don't have an answer to this, but I'd be very curious to hear more thoughts on it. Okay, back to the approach. I did force myself not to use any music in this episode, which was actually quite challenging. Of course, I've edited projects that didn't use music before, but in this particular format, it was actually not that easy. And therefore the episode relied heavily on sound design to accentuate the visuals. So let's get into that. The sound design is mostly quite realistic and almost entirely motivated by the visual elements. Since this series aims to capture specific moments, the intention was to make these moments more salient and immersive. In this rare case, I actually used some bits of the on-camera audio, which I would normally never recommend, but there were just some sounds captured by the camera that couldn't be recreated. I took some time to consider what was more important, the audio quality or accurately reflecting the soundscapes of these specific places and moments, and I think you can guess what I chose. So then I had to cover up or support those bits of audio with better recordings. For the most part, I used field recordings that I had done with an old Zoom 1 handy recorder, from specific motorcycle pass-bys to market sounds. The Zoom H1, by the way, is a nice, cheap, travel-friendly audio recorder. For the motorcycle pass-bys, since I was recording in stereo with an XY layout, you can hear the direction that the motorcycle is riding in. So I had to match up the direction and timing of the motorcycle pass-by sounds to the visual cues. This wasn't always ideal, so in certain cases I had to tweak things slightly using panning keyframes or automation if you're working in a DAW or digital audio workstation. This basically meant that I would set a keyframe for the left-right pan to a certain value at a certain part of the video, and then at a later part in the video I would set another keyframe with a different left-right pan value, and the software will then transition from the first value to the second value, basically making it sound like the sound is either panning from the left to the right or the right to the left. For more general additions to the atmospheric soundscape, I used some sounds from the sound library from Free to Use Sounds, which I mentioned in the last video. Naturally, in these recordings, there are some very distinctive moments in them, like voices and music, And I tried to avoid taking these widths since I wanted the final piece to represent the exact places portrayed at the time they were recorded. So I tried to focus on using audio sources that I had recorded on location. Obviously, for sounds like motorcycles and cars, this was less important, but here I'm mainly referring to things like market sounds. I got as far as I could with these sounds until I realized that some sections were going to require Foley in order to properly recreate the scenes they were depicting. If you care about your soundscape, you'll probably come to a point where you need to record sounds yourself. You'll need a very specific sound that you just can't find in a sound library. This is where Foley recording comes in, which is when you recreate and record sounds in post-production. The best part about this is that you can create a tailor-made soundscape for your project that will use sounds that no one else has. Also, in some rare cases, it's actually faster and cheaper to just record the sounds yourself. I'm personally not a fan of searching through sound libraries to find sounds because it's never exactly the sound you want, whereas with Foley you have full control, but it can also be very time consuming. So you need to learn when it makes sense to be pedantic and when you need to move on. So when recording Foley, you might think it's best to record your sounds in a similar sound environment to that depicted in your video. Well, not really. You generally want the quietest and least reverberating recording space you can find. Obviously, ideally, you'd be working in a soundproofed recording studio, but a small room with carpet and where the sound doesn't bounce too much off the walls also works. This means you can get a clean recording, and then if you want to add reverb or delay, you can fine-tune that yourself in your software of choice and not be forced to use whatever reverb you accidentally recorded, because once it's baked into the recording, it's nearly impossible to remove. When recording Foley, a shotgun mic is usually used since you tend to be singling out specific sounds, but in theory, any decent microphone will work as long as it's able to capture the frequency range you're trying to record. The most important things to consider when recording Foley are materials, textures, and timing. So obviously you need to find objects or materials that can recreate the sounds you're trying to depict from your video. It doesn't have to be exactly the same thing, it just needs to sound convincingly like that thing. And then you just need to time your movement or action to respond directly to the visual cue in your video. So let me take you through a specific example. Here we have two people sharing a drink together. I really liked this moment, and I knew I wanted it to be a calm, quiet scene. So for atmosphere, I just added an alleyway Atmos track as a background sound. And then I recorded the sounds of the bottle. The bottle I used was a bit bigger and had a different shape, but as long as it's close enough, no one will really notice that. I knew I wanted the sound of the bottle against this bench surface and the movement of the liquid inside the bottle. The liquid was easy. I just turned it and let the water hit the neck of the bottle. The movement of the bottle from the surface was more complicated. It seems to be a smooth concrete surface, and I only found a little section of textured concrete where I was recording, so it took a while to get the right sound of the bottle dragging a bit while getting picked up. Luckily, the sound for putting down the bottle was quite a bit easier. Then, in post-production, the important part was making sure that these sounds actually fit into the scene. So the first thing was to take the volume down, since I recorded it quite close, but obviously in the shot we're quite a bit further away. Then I pitched it up a bit because it sounded still a bit too weighty and full for this distance. And then in the EQ, I sort of took out a lot of that low end. Again, from this distance, we're not picking up those lower bass frequencies. If you were listening to this in reality, you wouldn't hear that, especially with environmental noise outside. The final thing that really places this sound in the space is reverb. I was working in DaVinci Resolve, even though I wouldn't recommend it for sound design, but you can obviously do this in most NLEs and DAWs. It took me a bit of time to get used to the DaVinci Resolve Reverb stock plugin, but it's actually very intuitive. You can adjust the shape of the space you're simulating up here, The reverb time obviously affects how long your sound reverberates for. You can also adjust things like the brightness and distance to fine-tune it. And one of the most important aspects to making it sound natural is this dry-wet balance. Dry meaning no reverb and wet meaning full reverb. So this allows you to strike a balance between the original sound itself and the reverb within the space you're trying to create. And altogether it sounded like this. You don't need to fill in every sound. This, for example, was a really beautiful moment, and here I wanted to recreate that feeling of a nice shared journey looking out the window together. You're not thinking about the sound of the bus or the people talking inside, so I didn't want to include that in the soundscape. I want you to experience this moment like a human that filters out these sounds after sitting in the bus for a while, auditory adaptation. So just remember, you're creating a subjective interpretation of visual cues. If you have the flexibility to integrate that into your narrative intention, why not lean into that subjectivity? Food for thought. That's all for this breakdown. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.